Welcome, everybody. My name's Matt Ward. I'm one of the co-directors here of Uro Publications and one of the owners of this bookshop that we're finally getting to open to the public for a little bit of, well, obviously we were set up for the exchange of ideas right from the get-go, but exchange of ideas right in person. We've long wanted to be able to have some good conversation in this space, and it's a real privilege to have you all here today, so thank you all for coming. Before we kick things off, I just wanted to do a short acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. Today's event is obviously the Melbourne book launch of Rory Hyde's new book, Architects After Architecture, which he was a co-editor on with two other people I don't know actually, Harriet Harris and Roberta Macaccio. Very shortly, Rory's got a short presentation for us, and then we're going to have a brief conversation, and then we'll probably throw it out to the crowd, which is kind of the way we prefer to do things. The event today is as COVID safe as we can possibly make it. If anybody feels uncomfortable about the number of people in this room, well, we can open the door if you prefer, and we can certainly offer seats outside. We've got a PA set up out there so the event can be heard in the alleyway if need be. We've also got loos just around the corner. You'll see if you turn right out the front door here, turn left, the toilets are on your left-hand side. We've got two exits here, one here, and an emergency exit behind this door here as well if we need to get out quickly. The other thing that's worth mentioning today, guys, is we are actually running a live stream of the event to Facebook, so if anybody's uncomfortable about that, just be aware the camera is now filming and it's there in the corner. The focus is very much here on Rory and myself, but if you're wandering around at the front, you're probably getting captured at some point as well. That's about it from me. We've obviously got Rory's fantastic book available for sale tonight, and your ticket price entitles you to a $10 discount off that book, which I think is a pretty good price, quite honestly. So please grab a copy if you haven't already, and I'm sure Rory will oblige and sign the book on request. That sounded like a command. More or less. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rory.
Thank you, Matt. Great to be here in a real shop with real people to talk about this book. We've done a couple of launches all on Zoom, and this is much more intimate, polite, nice. So Architects After Architecture. Again, just to give a big shout out to co-editors, Harriet Harris, who's the Dean of Architecture at Pratt, Roberta Macaccio, who's an editor and architect with the Architecture Association in London. We worked on this together for the last 18 months or so. So through lockdown, we had lots of all our design meetings and so on. But today, I'll just talk through some of the key ideas, and then, yeah, let's have a discussion about it. This is the real question people who studied architecture do. We were originally approached actually by the Institute of Architects to do a book for recent graduates. Like, okay, this is how you get out into the world and this is what you need to know. This is how you register your practice. This is how you send an invoice, like the really practical stuff. And we sat down and we mapped it out and we said, yeah, but there's already loads of books about that. Like, what about all the people, the really interesting stuff that people are doing which are not in conventional practice? Like, we need a book for those people. And looking at the stats, by some measure, it's 60% of graduates do not become fully fledged conventional architects in the sense that they get registered and so on. So we thought there's this huge number of people out there, and there isn't a book for them that tells them what are your possibilities, what are the opportunities that you have going out into your career. So we pulled together 40 examples, and the way to think about it is really as a kind of menu. So the sort of ideal reader for us is a student or a recent graduate, somebody who's trying to, I guess, find their direction. They know they're interested in architecture, they've got the skills, but they may not know which way to direct them. So I'll really quickly rattle through the contributors. Jeremy Till, Sarah Wigglesworth, Liza Fior, Justine Clark, Joss Boys, Andres Hake, Interborough, Joel Sanders, Public Works, Doina Petrescu, Takeshi Hayatsu, Peter Barber, Sib Trigg, Assemble, Pascal Sablan, Elsie Orsu, Baroness Lawrence, the Stephen Lawrence Foundation, Rotor, Work AC, Ant Farm, the 1960s counterculturalists, Jack Self, Roger Zagolovich, Holly Lewis, Peggy Deemer, Forensic Architecture, Mulkeet Shoshan, Kimberly Meyer, Judith Clark, Alex Schvedder, Miriam Bellard from Rockstar North, Matt Jones from Google, Gavin Johns, Matt Storis, Scott Patterson, Studio Folder, who designed the book, Chris Hildry, Damon Rich, Finn Williams, Shelley Penn, and Shireen El-Nashi, and Robert Mull. So the way we organised the book was really around these two clusters. So this is a sort of conceptual diagram which seeks to, I guess, assemble the concept. In the centre we have architecture as it's like traditionally conceived, and then on the left we have what we're calling plus, which is people who would still call themselves architects, but they're doing architecture and then something else, something more. So it's architecture plus community, architecture plus kind of making practice, plus a serious engagement with climate change, plus inclusion in its broadest sense. And then on the other side, we have beyond. And these are people, again, so everyone studied architecture, everyone might have started out on that path, but now they may not call themselves architects, and they're into a sort of new territory or adjacent territories to architecture. Activism, public works, new forms of practice, design, technology, culture, media, arts, that sort of thing. And one of the common threads through all of these practitioners is this confrontation with crisis, especially the 2008 crisis, which seemed to kind of redraw the boundaries of what was possible. And a lot of these people graduating, as I did, into that crisis, trying to reevaluate what they were doing and realising that there wasn't a job ready for them. So they had to reinvent what they do. And we're kind of in a similar position now, which I think is interesting. And that's hopefully where the book can be really useful to current practitioners and current graduates. So what did we learn? I'm just going to rattle through some of the kind of big threads through the book. A critique of the traditional practice. So when I studied at RMIT here, when I finished about 12 years ago, you know, the private practice was architecture. There wasn't any other way. Those two things were kind of one and the same. And I think we came to realise that actually that's a really narrow version of what architecture is or can be, and there's this big broad spectrum out there. And I learned that sort of the hard way when I was at MVRDV, where the sort of idea of where we sat and what we did was very firm, and if you wanted to go outside of that, there was a lot of resistance. A uniquely versatile way of thinking. So this is one of the examples in the book, which is Chris Hildry. Again, of course, studied architecture, became interested in homelessness, and then through collaborating with homeless charities in London, he said it was a really formative moment when someone told me, a woman from the charity, whatever you do, do not design a better cardboard box. Like, the homelessness is not a question of shelter, it's a question of access to services. And so he, through a very close study of homelessness in London, looked at these tipping points where people fall out of the formal system, where they can't pay their rent, then they end up on someone's sofa, they don't have a fixed address, they fall out of doctor's care, and the whole thing just cascades, they can't keep their job. And so he created a thing called proxy address, which uses the unused address within the London database, so there's sort of ghost addresses, if you like, that you can receive. You can use them to register for things, and you can receive posts, but you don't have to live there or own the property. And so through that, he gives these to people who are homeless, and they're able to subscribe and participate in the formal system. So a brilliant use of spatial architectural thinking, but very much not a built outcome, but incredible consequence and social impact. Miriam Bellard from Rockstar Games, which is one of the world's biggest games companies. I mean, you've all heard of Grand Theft Auto, of Red Dead Redemption and so on. And Miriam studied architecture in New Zealand. She then interned within games development and worked for Peter Jackson briefly on Lord of the Rings. And now she's the lead environment designer for Rockstar Games. When we did a talk with her a couple of weeks ago at Pratt, I introduced her and she said, "It's great to be here. I've never spoken at an architecture school." You know, this is somebody, without exaggerating, hundreds of millions of people have been inside her spaces, her virtual buildings, but she's never been treated like she's an architect. So that's part of the sort of project, is to almost welcome people like that back in and to say, no, this is legitimate design, this is legitimate architecture. You should be, you know, teaching students, you should be thinking in that way. She's the sort of Frank Gehry of the virtual world that you've never heard of. Architecture is a tool for justice and for inclusion. So we've got a number of pieces in this space, but just to mention one, Joel Sanders, who's an American architect based in New York, created a toolkit called Stalled, which shows how you can redesign gender-separate bathrooms to be gender inclusive, within the same footprint. So it's about, he gives a great talk on how this works, but it effectively makes it a safe space, a supportive space, a social space, and it can be used as a kind of toolkit to retrofit public buildings, museums, galleries, that sort of thing. Architecture can be used to address major challenges. So the other contribution here is forensic architecture, who of course have redeployed those skills that we think of as traditionally architectural, of mapping, of research, of drawing, of animation, in the service of, for example, advocating for people who are displaced, or for uncovering justice within a war situation, for example, and using that as a tool to advocate for people who are underrepresented. But that idea that it can be used to address major challenges is also something that runs through the work. Is what we realise, once you kind of take that relationship between the designer and the client away, you can operate in different spaces, you can operate for different kinds of people, you can ask different questions, you can assume different answers. And that's the really liberating thing, I think, that sits at the centre of this book, is once you realise that the architectural thinking can be reapplied in different contexts. And that's really comes to the kind of crux of the book, which is a questioning of what architecture is altogether. We like to pretend, I think, that it's about designing buildings, but perhaps that's just a convenient fiction to narrow the scope of our way that we can apply our skills. So what would happen if we instead defined architecture not as by its product, by the building, the outcome, but as a process, as a way of thinking about the world, as a way of synthesizing different inputs, as a way of hosting conversations, as a way of creating briefs, as a way of proposing new ideas, and as a practical tool to get us to those ideas. And once you kind of abstract that one layer away, you realise the potential and the possibilities are really amazing. But more importantly, perhaps, these are the kinds of skills that we really need today to address the big challenges that we all face, like homelessness, like climate change, like the housing crisis, like COVID. I mean, it's amazing that one of our colleagues at Melbourne Uni was part of the COVID response team here in Melbourne, and that kind of intelligence can be applied to something like as dynamic and terrifying as a pandemic. So, and once you ask that question, then for me, the next one is, well, who are we responsible to? You know, and this gets to the real criticism, I think, of architecture, which is that we're a public discipline, we're a protected profession, and yet we serve a very tiny proportion of society. We only can work for people who can afford to employ us. And I think that's kind of, we're breaking the social contract. We're in breach of the obligation that we have to serve all of society. And so hopefully this is a way that we can start to broaden our applicability and become more useful, and in that sense to maybe reclaim some relevance as well. So anyway, that's the whole book in one picture, which basically says there's more to it than just that bit. Yeah. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rory. I'm going to spin around a little bit. You kind of already asked my first question, which is a slightly pedestrian sort of publisher talking shop question, which is who is the imagined audience for the book? And you spoke about the publishers approaching you to create a book ultimately to talk to recent graduates. Is that still the imagined audience for the book?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the things I was really surprised by the response to Future Practice is that I also thought that that was the very same narrow audience, but you know, surprisingly, people came up to us and who, you know, from other disciplines who discovered a lot in it. So I think that it works both ways, doesn't it? You know, it may be for architects, but because we've got people who are from technology and from activism and from that, you perhaps speak to those audiences too, and then they discover more about architecture. So I think it works both ways, and that's where these things become really interesting and useful. I mean, all books are a kind of vehicle for conversations. So, yeah, it's exciting to see where it could go.
Yeah, I mean, we got obviously a pretty detailed glimpse of the cast of characters in the book, but I have to say it's very diverse in terms of the content as well. It's not really that authored as far as your writing and so forth is concerned. It's other people's voices, a lot of interviews obviously as well. And
it's funny, I had a reviewer ring me up the other day who he was reviewing the book, and he said, it's really mixed bag, like I don't understand where all these people fit. And I kind of said, yeah, well, that's the point. Like you want this broad. It's not. We haven't like trimmed them to fit our thesis. It's almost like a platter that you can choose from, and there's going to be some stuff that doesn't speak to you, and some stuff that will. But that's the whole point. Yeah.
I've got a slightly personal question, I guess. You mentioned graduating obviously into the GFC. What drew you to study architecture in the first place? Did you want to design buildings?
Oh, I don't know. It was never that clear. I think I had an art teacher at high school who said that it might be interesting. I didn't know what it was, you know, until I got there and enrolled. But you know, it's the so I didn't know then, but I know now, and it was, as I sort of mentioned in the conclusion, that it's this combination for me of the, you know, being able to have a sort of vision, which in the good sense, in the sort of artistic sense, but then also having the kind of pragmatism to see it through and to show people the way to get there. That's what I love about architecture, and that's what I keep trying to recover. So when it gets defined as something really limited, it's sort of like, no, but the possibilities are much bigger than this, so let's keep redrawing that boundary. And that's really what I've been trying to do through these various projects and so on.
Yeah, there's a bit of a tension there between the idea of vision and obviously the idea of the visionary author or architect, obviously, in this instance.
I mean, the step that I missed there is which I did say before, is the synthetic part. And I think that your architects are very good generalists at speaking, knowing a little bit about a lot of things. And I think as long as we can preserve that ability to host a broad conversation and get people around the table, and then to synthesize those different inputs to then create the vision. So it's a kind of democratically informed vision rather than, you know, me on my own in the studio with scrumpling up bits of paper. Then it can be more socially purposeful rather than just a kind of willful form-making project.
I mean, and this possibly sounds like a slightly trite question, but I don't mean it in that
Go
way.
on.
Is it still important for architects to know how to design a building in that context?
I think it is for, yeah, that's a really important question, and to be really clear, yes, it is. But maybe not all of them. Do you see what I mean? So maybe there's let's preserve the core, a core of architecture around designing buildings. And maybe if you were running a school, you wanted like, I don't know, 70%, or let's use the same 60% that the statistics tell us. 60% of those will go on to get registered and go on to be architects. And this book is about the other 40%, which is to say, look, where else can you be useful? What else can you do? So it's not about attacking that 60% or saying that they're wrong, but it's about saying, let's develop the other 40% and show where else it can go. Yeah.
So in that context, the subhead to the book obviously is alternative pathways to practice. I've got here, what does it mean to architect for those 40%? There's obviously, we talked about that syncretic skill.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just about saying that, it's interesting, we did a talk this morning. I did a talk this morning at 5 o'clock in Toronto time with a video game designer again and a woman who does air pollution real-time mapping. And they'd both similarly studied architecture, but they didn't call themselves architects. And I think this is about saying, no, let's like welcome you back into the fore, and they felt really, again, that they'd been kind of pushed out, or that it wasn't legitimate what they were doing. And I think we need to expand that definition of what we consider to be legitimate architecture. It's not just about building buildings. And that comes back to the sort of broader ecosystem of recognition, which is through awards and magazines and through publication and talks and things. Let's invite those people into all of those forums too.
Into the awards mill. There seems to be more and more award categories every year, I have to say.
Well, that's a good thing, I would have thought. In London, anyway, the RABA, which I don't normally champion, started a new award called the McEwen Award, which is about social architecture. So, of course, every building ought to be social, but to somehow have its own category foregrounds the different type of work that may not be as, it just gives it a space and a focus that it needed. Yeah.
I mean, there's obviously also that dynamic with the awards, a sort of legacy perhaps of older modes of practice, where it's very much, it's about the author ultimately in the awards program. It's typically the guy with his name on the shingle, so to speak. And
exactly. So there's, even within those systems, the legacy of that version of architecture which need to be questioned as well. Yeah. It runs deep.
Yeah, it does, very much so.
And again, I don't want to tear that down, but simply to say, like, there are other ways to do it. So maybe it's about a parallel process. Yeah.
One of the, well, actually there were two contributors who both penned a piece with Richard and Daniel Suskind, I think, in the book. Was that right?
Well, they're mentioned in the intro, but yeah.
They talk about this idea of the grand bargain. Can you tell us a little bit about what the grand bargain is?
Yeah, I mean, they did a book called The Future of the Professions, and which I found super useful to relate to architecture. And they look a lot at medicine, and this moment in Britain anyway, in the 1940s, after the war, when the NHS was being set up, the National Health Service. And the doctors were super resistant to this. They had their private practices, they had their private clients, they had people, they were busy enough. They didn't want to go into this public system and only have the government as their employer. And I realised, wow, that's kind of where we are with architects. We've all got our private offices, we've all got our private clients. We're kind of happy serving those people who pay us well. We don't want to deal with like the whole of suburbia or anyone who doesn't have less than $200,000. And actually, the doctors were forced to create a system that was where they were responsible for the health of everybody. And I think, I mean, it's interesting to connect it also to the project that was happening outside here in the courtyard with Mary Featherston and Susie Atwell, where they're looking at livability and people's interiors, especially after this last year, and homes that aren't working well for people, and trying to have a big, broad public conversation that's not limited by discipline, that says, you know, how do, there they are, they're unpacking their umbrellas. How do we invite those people into this conversation and you know, help them to articulate how their homes can work better for them and how they can support their lives in a different way. And so that would be one direction that more, you know, what Daniel and the Susskind father-son talk about, which is the grand bargain where if you're a protected profession, you're responsible for everyone. And lawyers kind of do it through legal aid. The doctors certainly do it because they were forced to. And architects do not. And I think we need to confront that.
Does that mean bringing back government works and those kinds of institutions from the early 20th century?
I mean, yes, that's been a big, you know, the sort of retreat of the public sector is a big part of that. You know, famously, Finn Williams, who contributes also, shows data from Britain where almost 50% of architects were employed by the public sector in the 1960s at its peak. Now it's something like 0.5.
Oh, wow.
So that's part of it. But also I think we need to, it's in a way, you know, to use the medicine example again, we're all brain surgeons. We're all hyper specialists. It takes 2 years to do a house, you know, and what would a kind of architect GP look like who's doing, you know, 5 prescriptions in an afternoon? And maybe, but seeing those same people every couple of months, you know, so it's a different relationship to time and to scale and to input. And maybe we need one of those on every street. Yeah.
I just popping back a little bit to the GFC and what that resulted in ultimately for you, of course, was your first book, Future Practice, where you were looking at potential new models for practice. At that stage, it was, I mean, fantastic book, but relative to the diversity of practitioners in this current book, probably a lot slimmer, and it didn't seem like there was a huge amount of material out there for you to work from when you were trying to envision this new potential future practitioner. Reading the book now, it doesn't really feel like that. It feels like that perhaps practice has moved on a little bit. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, I think it feels like it's legitimate now, more so. Whereas then it felt like a very fringe thing, and it was almost like this radical thing to do an alternate practice, and that was how it was always framed. And now I think it's hopefully not that. Hopefully it can be just practice, and we don't have to always preface it with like alternative or radical, or, you know, because it, in a way, you know, we want to pull the centre towards this, or expand the centre, and not to have those boundaries between who's corporate and who's like guerrilla. Yeah.
A lot of that felt like it was a kind of direct response to the sort of the more extreme. I think Jeremy Till has a great way of describing this in the book, where he talks, how did he describe it? I've forgotten now. It was a beautiful turn of phrase anyway, but the sort of the acrobatic architecture that we saw in the early 2000s in Dubai and other locations, and in fact all over the world. And then as a result of the GFC, it was an opportunity for people to reflect on whether or not that was really what was worthwhile in the practice of architecture. That
feels a long way away now.
It does. It really does. And I'm kind of curious if you see this recent crisis producing a similar kind of moment in kind of self-reflection for practitioners, and where that might lead ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly centred on the home, it will. You know, I was editing an interview with Dolores Hayden, who I'm a huge fan of, who has written about, for instance, 19th century feminist collaboratives and cooperatives, and the sort of radical history of urban neighbourhood design. And she described the last year as a real confrontation with who is doing the work. You know, when schooling gets brought into the home, when you know, work gets brought into the home, the division of labour, and you know, many women who had to quit their jobs just to service the home schooling and you know, keeping up with life. And well, why did the women have to do that? You know, there's very few examples of men doing that. And actually putting all of that in one space and on display has hopefully, in her reading, forced a confrontation with the inability to kind of structure life and time and space and care. And so I think that that will be a big space where we need to challenge it. And it can be done through design, but it also needs many other things. And in her instance in the US, you know, it means you know, stuff that we take for granted here in a way. Of course, it can always be better, but around childcare or around parental leave or these kinds of things.
And of course, parks and gardens, where we're pretty well facilitated, or at least in the centre of Melbourne.
Yes,
and there's been a lot of reflection.
I think it's the social stuff, not so much the, you know, there were so many responses early on in the pandemic which were about like keeping 2 meters distance and, you know, this like geometric obsession with what COVID means, of course, which kind of misreads the whole point or the whole lessons that we've learned. So I think it's more on the way that we socially organise our lives than on how we design spaces that are well ventilated, even though that will be part of it.
Yeah, I was about to say it's a very spatial way of looking at it in lots of ways. That idea of, you know, measuring the space and understanding cross-flow ventilation and so forth. It's an architect's way of thinking of it.
The 60% of proper architects can do that job, but there's another job for redesigning the. I was going to say redesigning the family, but that doesn't sound right. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's sort of like time, space, and architecture.
Alerting people to the possibilities, maybe, the other alternatives. I've actually reached the end of my question, so I think we might throw it out to the floor. Anybody feeling brave?
Lots of questions.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Thanks, Rory. It's great hearing about the book. Of course, all of this directs us to the spaces of pedagogy, both of us being, you know, at the University of Melbourne and so forth, and working with thesis-level students, to whom we can also say the end of your thesis doesn't have to result in a building. There are these other opportunities for imagining what architects can do, and I wonder whether you could speak to that space a little bit, that moment, that threshold moment.
Yeah. It is tricky though, isn't it? And I think that there's still, I think it needs to be a subject or a lever. If it's not an object, it needs to be something else that's transformative. And it's the sort of ambiguity around what that something else is that I think we perhaps need to put more flesh on. And maybe it just means, I mean, one of the things that I think would be great to do is a sort of index or an atlas of those sorts of projects that we could then use to, you know, bolster that territory and to bring some confidence to students who wanted to go in that direction. Because what I worry, I guess what I'm saying is that I worry that it leaves the student exposed to a system that is used to evaluating projects which are formal and spatial, and that's for me feels like a difficult responsibility unless we're able to guide them confidently. So I think that's where we need to kind of assemble more examples or something, so that we can be exactly.
Surely your book also offers us.
Well, exactly. Hopefully, there's 40 more that we can add to the list in our atlas. And we need many more again, yeah.
It's quite funny now we play that discussion out in this room, but I have a little bit, you know, I like to provoke a little bit, because I think it's nice to look at the 40% who do something else, which is like creative practice or cultural practice or going to a different domain. And I've certainly celebrated students doing that, but I'm actually a little bit at the point where I think we can't say the other 60% can keep on doing architecture as we used to. So I think we have now a little bit in the pedagogy, the responsibility or the chance to also change practice in a very quick way. I mean, that's what I enjoy about education. It takes 5 years and you get them in a different mindset, and that kind of is guerrilla tactic for practice. Because we have other responsibilities than the traditional 60%. We have to change in an industry which is responsible for 40% of CO2 carbon footprint in the world in production and, you know, energy consumption. That we really have to go, okay, how can we tackle this? And we have to rethink that. And maybe that means building less, building different, taking care, repairing, changing lifestyle modes, responding to your client. No, you shouldn't do that because maybe you're trying to solve a problem which you should solve with counseling or something. So it's like, you know, they like to be much more critical about the actual architectural practice as we know it. So the same as we started being critical about star architects, and even Rem Koolhaas suddenly started being critical about star architects. So it's like kind of weird. So architects are also very good of taking every conversation and going, yeah, I agree with this, but then what are we going to do about it? So I think there is a responsibility, and possibly the easiest way to influence the discipline is to teach a criticality and a toolbox which expands beyond what we traditionally think a normal building is. We should not give up on the normal building, but we should give up on that the normal building, bit the conversation we had in the morning, that we should rethink what's given doesn't have to be that way. So how could the discipline be different and buildings and architecture be different, which the 2 panels this morning basically were, with a visionary and with a kind of whole ecological and Anthropocene critique.
No, I think that's right. And in a way, I've tried not to be hostile to the other 60%, but implicit in all of this is to say, well, look, here's 40 people who were really directed to a particular question, and they've reconfigured the way that they work in order to address that question. And so within that, I think is an implicit criticism of the kind of business as usual. Like we just inherit this business model and that's what we're going to do as for the 60% who stay in architecture. And I think that what they show is that you know, if you set yourself a really clear target, and whether that be, okay, let's do a building with no concrete, no steel, no aluminium, that's a really good, clear question. But architects don't frame questions in that way. Whereas these people who are saying we need to, you know, design this thing or to reconsider this service are setting really clear questions. So I think there's something in that we can learn in the approach that we could then apply even to very conventional practices. And that's why we've got the plus and beyond. So half of these people are architects. And, you know, they are the ones who are redefining what it can be. Somebody like Peter Barber, who, you know, is, if you walked into his office, it would look, you know, exactly as you would imagine an architect's office, drawings everywhere, models, blah, blah, blah. But he's developed a way of doing social housing and housing for the homeless, and the whole funding models around that, which, you know, is very much not the case of a practice where they're waiting for the phone to ring and the next commission to come in. So I think that it's also about change from the inside too. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sarah Hobday North, Architectrix on Twitter, and I wrote a little review of this. I'm interested in your concept of the architect as GP, and my question is, I guess, about what would you anticipate any pushback from within the profession as a GP model radically changes the accessibility and access to architects, and will that be too great a disruption to the exclusivity and luxury of architecture, which is still very much our brand to the general public? And yeah, if you could talk around that tension a bit.
Yeah. No, good question. And I think exactly 100%. I mean, it's so unglamorous, the idea of being an architecture GP, isn't it? Someone, you know, walking around to your office to say, where should I put my TV? But it's like these kinds of questions. I really think that it can help you to live a better life. I mean, what got me onto this was a fantastic article by, I think it was Atul Gawande in the New Yorker, where he's a brain surgeon, and he was interviewing or speaking to his GP. And they had this sort of competition. Who's got the most, makes the most impact on someone's life? And Atul Gawande says, well, of course I do. I'm a brain surgeon. I studied for 20 years. I come in with my scalpel and I can fix you in one operation. You just sit there tearing off bits of paper, like what could you do? But then of course that's his sort of setup. And then he says, no, there's been many studies on this, and actually in terms of real like health, life outcomes, the GP has a massively bigger impact on people's lives. And that's where the comparison to architecture is again. I think we design these singular things which are just to be photographed on day one, and then we kind of walk away, and people have to sell or they move or what if instead of the project being the project, the client was the project? Is I guess what I'm saying. And we were there to help people through their lives rather than to create things that they lived in. And it's, I think it's deceptively powerful flip. But it's very unglamorous and no one will sign up for it, so you have to force them.
And will there be pushback?
Well, absolutely. Yeah, no one will want to do it. No one will volunteer to do this. That's why we...
You think that'll be the pushback? Sorry.
I don't know.
From practitioners rather than two sides.
What do you think? Would you sign up to do it?
Well, that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, well,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I would.
There are actually in Germany some initiatives where you get a free hour with an architect without being charged, to start talking about maybe what you might want to solve, or whether you would want to use an architect and what that means and what it entails. So
no, I didn't know about it.
And it's in public setting, so you can just book it in and go there.
Don't we have an architect centre here? I thought that there used to be an architect centre here. Didn't there in Melbourne?
Archie Centre, yeah, they
It
still exists, it's not what it was.
no,
Okay,
that was the promise of it. The curators is a small home service, which is also doing a similar thing. Yeah.
We need to work on that.
Yeah, exactly.
Far corner. We have another question. He's going to yell.
Thanks for the publication, Rory. I was particularly pleasantly surprised that you included one of my peers from the 70s.
Oh, who's that? Say again?
In Ant Farm.
Oh, good, yes.
And in particular for those who aren't aware of the provocations that Ant Farm stimulated, particularly here in Australia, with the Dolphin Embassy, car opera, Ned Telly, a whole range of extraordinary activities. I was wondering if you could speak to your choice in curation of the talent.
Yes.
So the question there for people listening outside and listening at home is, why did you choose Ant Farm ultimately? Why make that decision?
It came via Work AC, so Dan Wood and Amal Andros, who are New York architects, they had done a collaboration with them to reimagine the Dolphin Embassy and their 3C city, which is a sort of floating convention centre. But also it was the dolphins could swim up into the ship and then also drive it. And they were really serious about this. You talk to them, and we had a couple of conversations with Chip Lord, who said, yeah, there was the whole thing, animal-human communication. We read this paper about how babies can already think very clearly, they just can't verbalize it, and we thought that would be the same with animals, so we designed this thing for dolphins to drive the ship. And there's this fantastic photo which we should have put in, which is of Doug Michaels, I think one of the others, showing a picture of the Dolphin Embassy to a dolphin, explaining it to him, like in the pool, like, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that was the thing. We wanted to have a couple of, like, plant a few, locations in history where we felt that these ideas were already resonant, and Ant Farm were very much saying, okay, we've taken this architecture thinking, let's apply it now to land art, let's apply it to media, let's take the radicalism of a Buckminster Fuller lecture and make it performative, and so for us that's still architecture, even though, again, they you know, we're not considered conventional and so on. So, yeah. Exactly. That's right. No, fantastic.
We've got some more. I should also point out we do have some wonderful ant farm monographs available, everybody. Another question there. I'll see if I can reach.
I can just talk.
Okay.
I read a fair bit of your work last year. I'm a student at Uni Melbourne about Robin Boyd and the small home service and the idea of the architect practicing as the GP. And I think in one of your papers you wrote that more so than the new mode of practice, what we need is the cultural shift. And so like the idea of, you know, an architect who might be willing to be on a show like one of the renovation shows, I forget their names. And I guess it's easier to imagine new ways of practice than to imagine new ways to inform the public, because our practice is so insular and we seem to operate within like kind of circles of people with certain tastes, even if they have kind of social interests. And do you see us, like, do you know anyone within our field or see the prospect of anyone in our field willing to get into the like really gauche world of normal people?
No, absolutely, and that's why I am such a fan of Robin Boyd and of the small home service and the small home section, which was in the newspaper every week in the Age when it was widely read. You couldn't do it in the Age anymore, but you could do it in the Herald Sun probably. But in terms of, so that's a really big inspiration for me to exactly get outside of the bubble, to speak publicly, to speak accessibly, and to invite people in. I mean, some people, short story. A friend of mine reckons that he pitched the idea for the block to Channel 9 when he was at Arup, but it was all about how you could make your house greener. Yeah, so it was sort of taking these sustainable ideas of and renovating to the mass market through the media. That was their idea. They said, you know, we've got to transform all of our homes across the country. The best thing to do is a really popular renovation show. And they said, no, we're not interested. And then 6 months later, they had the block, which is like the same format that they designed, but with none of the, like, you know, with style substituted for sustainability. So huge missed opportunity. And I had another thought, but Tim Ross, I think, is doing brilliantly, you know, with his documentaries, and I think that they're getting better. And you know, the next step might be not so much the nostalgia trip, but the projective. How do you change things? And so, yeah, that's somebody I think, you know, we ought to be really grateful for doing that, putting that out in the big audience.
Yeah. We've got to wrap things up soon, guys, but we've got time for one more question if anybody's got one. So the question there was whether or not these new practices are inherently alternative.
I'm optimistic. I'm not optimistic for business as usual. I think that that's a dead end. So whatever you do, you've got to reinvent what you do. But you know, the set of skills that you have are kind of like exactly what we need right now. So if you can find a place to apply them, then there's loads to do. But as long as we frame what we can offer in these very limited terms, as we've been speaking about around style or form or, you know, exclusivity, then no, it's completely dead end. Why, you know, there's it's just like fewer and fewer people who are interested in that. It's not socially useful. So yeah, I'm optimistic and I'm pessimistic for the road that we're currently on. But there's like a whole big space out there, this space, which is optimistic. Yeah.
Do you maybe think that other professions might start invading the traditional architecture profession, like you know, with digital?
Yeah, no, but that's happening massively. I mean, I wrote about that 10 years ago in Future Practice. We had a map at the start which said the shrinking iceberg of the architecture office and all these new incursions. And any architect today will tell you how much power the project manager has in the new forms of contracts, and how, you know, Matthias Bauer talks about peak architecture. 1959, the completion of the Seagram building in New York. Mies van der Rohe had all the power that anyone could ever have given him. He designed the whole thing himself. He, you know, documented it probably on, you know, 20 sheets of paper. It would take a whole library now. He got paid the most, he did the least work, he was, you know, all these things, peak architecture, and since then it's just like down, down, down. And I'm not here to rescue architecture or to even pretend to. It's sort of like, I'm here to show how we can be more useful for the public, to look at it from the other way. I don't really care if we get unemployed. It's like, we did it to ourselves, no, because we're so arrogant or useless. It's like, no, if you want to be, like, have a successful career, do something useful. That's all it's about.
And on that provocative note, I think I'm going to stop Rory before he gets himself lynched.
Exactly. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Rory.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.